I'm going to announce our next fireside chat. So let me introduce you to our esteemed host. Samuel Burke is the host for this chat, and he's an Emmy Award-winning bilingual business and technology journalist who has anchored, reported, and produced at CNN in Spanish, ABC, and NPR, which for those of you not familiar with American are like all the big stations that you can be on, basically. And he's the founder and executive producer at Loimas Productions. And in his chat with Sam Lessin, he's going to explore how to launch new products in the COVID era and what are opportunities and challenges. Please welcome Samuel and Sam.
We'll keep the names that way to make sure you know who we're talking about and to whom we're speaking. I'm also the host of a show called #WFH, Work From Home. So welcome to my home studio. This has been the site of my show, which I'm glad I can turn over to Sam. Now, Sam, before we really get to the meat of this conversation, I'm just curious to know if you can tell us a little bit more. We know that you're co-founder of Fin Analytics. So just tell us a little bit about what the company does and what your role is on a day-to-day basis. Then we'll get into launching products in the COVID era.
Sure. So thanks for having me. Excited to be here. Yeah. So Fin is a company I started with my co-founder, Andrew Cortina, a few years ago. He was the founder of Venmo. It's a very popular payments app in the United States. I, at the time, was VP product at Facebook, running a bunch of those teams. And we got really excited about human-in-the-loop operations work. So what does it mean to combine people and machines to create better service, basically? And we started kind of going deep on the space. The thing that really shocked us, coming from a pure consumer technology background and looking at service, was just, unlike what we were used to, it's really hard to understand the process of people doing, customer service, financial backend, like these types of things. If you come from a consumer product world, you're used to being able to do super specific A/B tests. You're used to services like a New Relic, which gives you great instrumentation, APM services to know exactly what's going on and how to debug things. But then when you start adding people into the loop, it's super hard to know what's going on case by case, task by task in order to optimize the people processing tools. So that's what Fin Analytics is we kind of teamed up and built effectively what you could think of as like a New Relic for people, right? Or an approach that allows you to take a scientific, truly full measurement approach down to the click stroke of how work's getting done so that you can improve it both through better coaching, better process, better tools, and things like that scientifically. So that's the 2 cents on Fin.
So I want to get to the heart of the matter, and that's really launching a product during COVID. And this might apply long term because as we look at places like the UK, where I am, where another lockdown is looming, and certainly other countries are already in their second lockdowns, how do you launch a product in lockdown? And what type of product launches have you been able to do during COVID?
Yeah, so it's been interesting. I've seen this from a few different angles. So first, obviously at Fin, it turns out that our product, while it's older than COVID, when you start having people work remotely and from home, the connectivity of understanding what's going on, kind of person by person, so you can optimize things is even more important. So we've seen and had to launch a whole bunch of work from home products, around what we're doing. I also do a lot of venture investing. So I'm one of the general partners at Slow Ventures, which is about a $500 million AUM fund out west. And, we've seen tons of companies launch things during COVID, new companies that were struggling all of a sudden become super successful, things that were doing great kind of really crater. So it's been a very disruptive time. I think, in my mind, launching new things during COVID is actually the hardest part. If you think about it, when you have remote teams working, it's actually, in some ways, I think at times even easier to just execute your plan, right? So if you have a plan already, if you're kind of like ready to go, from a team culture perspective, it's super easy to just go, right? And like produce a lot of great work. But I think it's super hard to have those really important meetings about how you change direction, about kind of more creative, wide-ranging thinking when you can't get everyone around in a room, right? Like that's just, I think, a real thing. So on the internal side, I think that's a real interesting quirk of where we are.
I want to pause you there because why do you think that's hard to do? I mean, some of the people who I've been talking to on my show, for instance, said this is the perfect setup for them. I talked to somebody who's the head of tech for engineering for Netflix, for instance. He said, I've been working remotely for ages. This is nothing new to me. So why should it be hard in the tech world to get everybody joined in a room, albeit a virtual room, to make some of these big decisions if so many of us have already been working like this? Specifically.
So here, like I'm really clear. I think that this is great for teams that have their set up, they're doing meetings, they're executing work, et cetera. I do think something is lost in the I'm passing someone in the hall, I have an oddball idea, et cetera. I mean, I don't know about you, but I think one of the things I found lost in COVID are really hard to recreate is kind of the moments with your colleagues or when you're working on a problem, it's a little bit more freeform, right? Like people do team events, they're really trying, people are figuring this out. And I think people will figure it out. But I do think that there's something really great about innovating new products where it's much easier to do if you get everyone around in a room. You allow that kind of, you have a beer, you allow that kind of almost blank time where oddball ideas can come up, as opposed to it being, I feel like work from home and remote work. Actually, personally for me, I actually think I'm more effective when I'm just executing in a work from home mode. I'm worried about that kind of creative component personally. But I don't know. I think different people have different approaches to that. And I do think that, for instance, it is far easier if you think about a work from home or remote environment or an in-person environment. I think either of those is great. I do think the hybrid is very, very difficult because, you have great collaborators who all of a sudden they're trying to cut in on a Zoom, they're trying to contribute something. And when there's an asymmetry where there's a lot of people in the room, but a few people not in the room, that I think is difficult personally, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. I'm somebody, I mean, from a personal standpoint, it's made my personal life much better. And yeah, okay, I'm able to host a show from here, but it is those creative moments that I'm missing. So what do you think is enhanced then for launching a product during COVID in spite of the challenges that you're talking about?
Yeah, I think there are a few things that are enhanced. One is we saw, at least in early COVID, and I think this will continue. I mean, people's appetite for new things and new ways to connect is just immense, right? And so if you think, I mean, again, there's all sorts of great new innovative products that might not have had, especially the time, people wouldn't have the time to focus on them, that all of a sudden, like people are very focused on. So I'll give you a great example out west. Two companies I'm really excited about, both in the audio space, are things like Clubhouse, right, which is kind of this audio chat room kind of experience, which is very popular in San Francisco right now. There's another one called Locker Room, right, which is just focused on sports and the sports vertical. I think things like that can blow up. I mean, I have to admit, I think TikTok's an amazing product. I think COVID has absolutely helped TikTok, right? Just because, again, people have more bandwidth and willingness to try things. Same thing with a lot of these kind of live events at home things. So I think consumer appetite for new things is way up in a way that it hasn't historically been true. And I think it will be for a while. So I think that's pretty cool in terms of creating opportunities that wouldn't otherwise exist. And then I also think that there's a lot in the B2B side where I obviously am building a company right now. I'll tell you what's happened, which is pretty interesting, which is there are all these companies and situations where the rule book just got thrown out, right? People knew how to operate. They were operating the same ways they always were. They might have a new idea or there might be a new product they might want, but look, why fix what's not broken, right? Like it's hard to kind of get kind of bandwidth, whereas everyone acknowledges that as the business world and the consumer world have shifted so dramatically, the rule books go out the door. And that makes receptivity and the willingness of people to try new things go way, way, way up, right? So I think broadly in the B2B and the B2B space, the appetite and willingness to try new things is very, very high right now, which is super exciting and super engaging. And again, I want to be really clear. I do think that from an execution standpoint, I'm not going to go back to an office 5 days a week. Right. I think it's been a real boon. I think it's been a great moment of learning for a lot of people because you just had to try something new. I just worry that actually in some ways companies and people will get less creative when, they're not having drinks around a table, when there isn't that blank space. Right. And until someone figures out how to recreate it is what I would say.
So I think the main question that so many people watching this will have then is, given what you're saying, the pluses and the minuses, to launch or not to launch? Are there any blanket statements you can make about that? Because I think whether it's the launch of Mulan for Disney and Disney Plus, or a much more micro product, a new app that somebody's looking to launch in a region, that's become the big question. And of course, with the way things are going, we don't know when there will be a vaccine. Are there any types of insights that you can share for us about people who are teetering right now about launching that product or not?
Look, I think the question is you have to adapt, but you might want to adapt your launch, right? So if you're launching a social network that's about meeting up in bars, you should probably adapt it, right? Like I think that's the reality, and I've seen companies do that very successfully, where it kind of opens up something new, they try something new, and kind of pivot around it. But it's interesting, I've built and sold companies myself. I've obviously spent a lot of time around startups. This idea that you would have something ready to go and just say, nope, I'm going to wait, right? Like, it just doesn't quite work in my mind. Like you should launch, you should just be thoughtful about what and launching that makes no sense given where we currently are. I guess maybe the extent of that is like, major Hollywood movies. Like I'm super bummed that, the Maverick, the Top Gun sequel is not coming out for a year. That probably makes sense, right? Maybe, but we'll see. We'll see how a lot of these digital releases go and kind of where we go from there, if that makes sense.
Well, I'm intrigued then to see what you think about Quibi. In case people aren't in the United States and don't know about Quibi, this was a product that had billions of dollars of investment, short videos that you can watch on the go. So movies broken up into chapters, very much meant for people sitting in the subway, sitting on buses, which of course none of us have been doing lately, or much less than we used to. And it's had a really dismal launch, unfortunately. I say unfortunately because I'm a journalist and a lot of my colleagues have gone to the Quibi platform. And of course, I want to see a flourishing media industry. So when you look at a company like that, what do you make? There are reports now that there might be a sale of this company, an acquisition. Yeah. So do you think they should have pivoted even more, or just some circumstances that you can't change?
Look, honestly, Quibi's success and failure had absolutely nothing to do with COVID. That might be the narrative they're weaving, right? And it's potentially a useful narrative for something. But look, I actually give them great credit. I'm all about bold moves. They raised a lot of money. They went out with a thesis. That thesis was wrong, right? The content, candidly, isn't very good if you've played with it. And I think, look, the short form content thesis, totally right. Mobile first, totally right. Unfortunately, that company's called TikTok, not Quibi, right? So I think the reality is people will always weave the narrative that makes sense for them, right? After the fact about where things end up. I give the founders of Quibi, I personally am really into it. Great credit for trying something super bold, going out with a huge announcement. Everyone knew from day one it was likely to fail. The history of companies being funded that way and set up that way and succeeding is quite scant. But it is one of those things where I wouldn't connect that very much to COVID. If the content had been great, right, and people were really into it, in an era where look, I'm literally running out of Netflix, Quibi would work, right? Regardless of whether you're on the subway or not. The problem is it's just there's no there.
So with these types of companies, then, do you think that they should have pivoted? And what type of content do you see out there? What type of platforms have you seen in COVID that have done the pivot very well? I'm guessing that you're saying that there was no chance for a Quibi to pivot, so I'll let you answer that. But do you have examples of things that you've seen that have really worked well?
Look, I think Quibi probably made a mistake out the gate by not pivoting to just offering the full TV, allowing you to see it on your big screen immediately. They had this hard stance against not letting you see things on your big screen, which is clearly insane in a world where people are home.
And they did adapt that. In fairness to them, they did allow you to use Google Chrome, but it was too late by that point. To your point.
But I don't honestly, I don't think that was the difference maker, right? For them, it was just the content wasn't there, and it was c'est la vie. Look, in the end of the day, in terms of adapting out the door with COVID, I think you've seen a huge number. I think a good example is the companies that are redirecting resources towards things like live streaming and things like paid live events and all sorts of things around that. So I think for instance, you've seen Facebook and Google will double down on all sorts of remote watch experiences. We can do it with groups. I think you've seen Slack. I'm sorry, I meant Zoom, spend a bunch more time quickly building an ecosystem, although again, they have a lot of work to do. So I think that you are watching lots of moving pieces move quickly, and you've seen a lot of companies. We're on the Hopin platform right now. Hopin, great example, people love it, was very well timed, right, in a lot of ways. And I think they've done a good job leaning into it. But I guess that's the way I put it is you don't launch or not launch, but you do lean into situations. And I think the reality is when you can kind of have a product and you see a few small tweaks, right, that would make it more successful in an era where people are going to be remote, when you prioritize features with the realistic expectation that, people aren't going to be in bars en masse living the way they were living X months ago or X years ago. That's kind of the way I think about it, just being sensitive to the current era.
And I'm curious to know what you think the landscape will look like for the tech world coming out of COVID. Who knows when that will be, and there may be a very different norm that we have for quite some time. But as things begin to ease, certainly at some point we will begin turning corners, and there could be a vaccine in 6 months, it could be 5 years, but their corners will be turned. So where do you see us moving, and what do you see the landscape looking like then?
Look, I think I was talking to a friend we were talking about the recovery and like how different cities are opening or not. And I think at the time, as far as we were concerned, and I'm sure someone can check us on this, San Francisco is probably like the least open of the major cities, right? And it's just because, again, it's obviously the highest concentration of tech workers in a lot of ways that have the most remote flexibility, et cetera. So I think, when you think about the world coming out of this, I said this very early. I read a column in The Information, which is a publication my wife founded. It's a subscription-only tech publication out west. And, in the column very early, I said, look, it's more than half of people aren't going back to the office. I think we're seeing that now repeated in a bunch of other places. We're going to be in a much more remote work-driven environment, which means there will be a different set of services, right, that'll need to exist and a different set of priorities for organizations that are building. I mean, I think there are some really interesting problems, like, on the venture capital side right now. On one hand, there's a lot of venture capital dollars flowing, right? It's not like COVID has slowed down VC at all. Like, things are getting funded. However, I do worry that like the really odd stuff doesn't get funded right now because people like are basically running their playbooks from their home. So again, this goes back to the whole creativity thing and how we come out of it is tech is going to keep chugging along. We're going to go more remote focused.
What do you mean by the odd stuff?
Innovation.
What do you mean by the odd stuff? And give us an example of maybe something that seemed odd but turned out to be very successful then that maybe wouldn't be funded in this time.
No, I mean, like, look, I think that it's a good question to push me on, which is specifically what I mean. But here's what I'm seeing. If you went to an Ivy League school in the US and then worked at Microsoft or Google or Facebook or whatever, and you come in and you have a business plan or a reasonable idea, you're going to get funded in this era. What's not going to get funded, right, is the, oddball college students, that don't have a CS background doing something super weird that just might be awesome, right? And so I think, and it's because you can't spend the time with them, you can't get to know them. I think there's there's less appetite for weird stuff. And again, it's a good thing to push me on, but I think a lot of the most interesting things in the world come from odd corners. And I really hope that tech, which has always been a very creative industry, and that's been one of its major driving forces, doesn't become too boring in this era. It'll be successful, but boring, where we just kind of do the obvious stuff because it's easy to do from home.
Well, I certainly think that speaks loads about where you think the economy is going in general. If the tech world doesn't get the type of capital flowing into it for all different types of projects, whether they fail or not, of course, doesn't matter in the economy, at least in the short term. It means that there's oil moving throughout the economy, and that oil that you're talking about won't be there. What do you make of when we think about this long term, working from home? As you say, you think it will be long term. So when you look at a company like Facebook, Twitter, and Google, I would say are the three drivers of moving to a permanent workforce that's work from home. How do you see that affecting the tech landscape? When I first heard that Facebook was going to move and try and get employees outside of their usual metropolitan areas, I thought, wow, this could be incredible for somebody in a place like Romania who wants to work for a company like Facebook, open so many doors and opportunities for them. Yeah. So what effect do you see specifically Facebook, where you've worked, that change in policy having on the tech ecosystem? Yeah, I mean, I won't speak to Facebook specifically, but if you want to talk broadly about that set of companies, what I'd say is this, is like, it's going to change a lot. Ironically, as the US goes to this very protectionist, closed borders era, the irony is this is going to blow those borders wide open, right? Because the second you have a default remote or a largely remote, company, all of a sudden, like the hiring, pipeline is wide open. What's that going to mean? Yeah, I do think it's a lot of great opportunities for talented people globally who might not be in like the prime centers or cities, where these companies historically hire. That's super exciting if you're a globalist, which I am, or want great things or great opportunities. But there'll be interesting secondary effects. And so I'll give you an example. It'll probably create a lot of downward wage pressure, right? Like the reality is San Francisco engineers make tons more money, right, than like what you'd expect from like a global talent base. The second you're like, oh, wait a minute, I really can hire globally, wages will come down. Same thing with like employee activism, right? Like a lot of the companies you messaged there's a lot around employee activism, right? Around like what the platform should and shouldn't be doing. I think that changes a lot when all of a sudden, like, there's global access to labor and people can kind of come from anywhere. The politics might shift of employee bases, which amazingly matter a lot in this day and age. So I think there's a lot of things that will change, but I think like, look, I mean, we talk about these companies as like coming around. The reality is there's this whole set of startups. I mean, GitLab being the most famous, I think right now, that kind of started
default work remote, deeply embraced it, have all sorts of documentation about how to run an open and successful culture remotely. Another one is Zapier. I could name a whole bunch. I actually think if you want to understand what the tech world's going to look like, you can kind of start by looking at how those companies are growing up. Some of them very successfully, and kind of mapping that to the broader ecosystem.
So not to get too much into economics, and we just have about a minute left, then do you see a deflationary period then in the technology ecosystem?
Deflationary, it depends how you think about that. I think technology in general does drive deflation, ironically, right? Which we can get into in more than 1 minute. But yeah, I think there's probably going to be downward wage pressure, if that's what you think, when you start opening up, a global hiring base, for sure. I do think that's going to have massive impacts on the politics of different states in the US and globally, on kind of, all sorts of things that are going to be really hard to draft out. I think if anything, people are underestimating the long-term impacts of COVID.
Yeah, and certainly that will have a huge impact in the San Francisco area, maybe not on the macro level for the rest of the United States and the world, but you'd have to think that there are going to be some major ramifications, especially in the real estate market. Sam Lessin, co-founder of Finn, thank you very much for joining us. Really great insights there on the tech sphere, but I think also broadly what you're talking about has some real implications for the economic period we're about to live through. So thank you very much for your insights.
Thanks for having me.
Samuel, thank you so much for being virtually with us. I love the bold perspectives around Quibi and all of the things that you talked about. I think that was very, very, very great insights. So thank you both for being with us here virtually in Romania.
Thanks for having us. All right.